Right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're really happy to have you. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Maria Friedman, and I represent the Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, which is a grassroots nonprofit coalition made of Christians and Jews that work together to combat anti-Semitism, educate about Israel, and promote the alliance between the U.S. and Israel. And tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Scholar. He's been studying this for years, and really the content of this presentation is aligned with our mission as well as community to educate people about different pros and cons. He will some statistics about anti-Semitism in the modern context, and I hope you learned something. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A discussion as well, and help yourself to any refreshments. Thank you so much. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to divide this talk into two parts. The first part is going to be dedicated to polling data, survey data on Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, primarily Anti-Defamation League data. They've been actually polling anti-Semitism since 1964. In the last 20 years, they've expanded their efforts to include global surveys, and they did one as recently as that was released as recently as 2 months ago on January 14th. And then I think those data, if you apply what we call in medicine triage, which is prioritizing the worst problem, will lead you logically to a particular form of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to elaborate on that in terms of its underlying theology. I've been using this definition of late by Vasily Grossman, a definition of anti-Semitism, because I think it's such an elegant definition. He was a Russian journalist and novelist who was the first to report, I believe, on the horrors of Treblinka concentration camp. He eventually ran afoul of the Soviet communist totalitarian regime for describing the horrors of the Gulag. And his work was censored for many years. But this, in the middle of this novel, Life and Fate, which a lot of it centers around the Battle of Stalingrad during World War II, he had this brief chapter where there's this basically a definition of anti-Semitism. He says, anti-Semitism is always a means rather than an end. It is a measure of the contradictions yet to be resolved. It is a mirror for the failings of individuals, social structures, and state systems. Tell me what you accuse Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. And so these are some data that I think a lot of you are familiar with. Or background information. The carnage that took place on October 7, 2023 in southern Israel was an unprovoked jihadist attack by Hamas. They were joined by local Gazan Muslims. There was an ostensible truce during the attack. And some Saudi reporting suggests that this might have been planned by Hamas leadership as far back as 2014. It was the largest single-day casualty toll for Jews since the Holocaust. Approximately 1,200 were murdered. Another 250 or so were held captive, and many of them, unfortunately, have turned out to have been killed. And the targets were disproportionately non-combatant children, women, men, and the elderly, about 90% probably. There were horrific atrocities committed by Hamas, by the local Gazan Muslims that joined them, and we've seen the evidence for that, which comes from surveillance videos around people's houses, eyewitness testimony, even forensic pathology evidence. But the atrocities were horrific: mutilation, torture, beheadings, mass rape, even burning. Right. The jihadist's own videos. And perhaps the most perverse phenomenon is that this tragedy, this carnage has been followed by a huge uptick in anti-Semitism. As I'll show you, anti-Semitism had been rising for the past decade. Again, relying a lot on ADL data. It was the highest number of incidents during any 2-month period since the ADL began tracking 2-month periods in 1979. So basically the 2 months after October 7th. There were all kinds of anti-Semitic incidents occurring in all walks of life, including physical assault. There was at least one murder in this early period. And the ADL averaged out about 34 anti-Semitic incidents per day in this first 2-month period after the attacks of October 7th. And they began to spread out to college campuses. And again, the rise was astronomical relative to a 2-month period in the previous year. Now, the one atrocity, and this is one of the problems with the ADL. They do an excellent job of collecting the data. How they spin it or interpret it is a problem. What the ADL didn't tell anyone about this one fatality in the early period was that it was a pro-Palestinian protester. Yes, but he was a devout Muslim computer science lecturer at California State University Northridge, and I'll show you why this actually becomes important. So if you look at the 15 months after the attacks through the end of 2024, this was a report in Ynet, the Israeli publication, that there were over 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. alone, and I agree with their assessment that the world was essentially normalizing anti-Semitism. And again, there were all kinds of incidents that across different walks of life, different populations, including notably U.S. campuses, and this really took off, I would say, in the spring of 2024. However, one thing that's interesting is that, of course, there was this big and, again, rather perverse spike after October 7, 2023, but there had been a steady trend of increasing anti-Semitic events over a 10-year period, and this was highlighted by the ADL CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt. He said, "We started to see a spike in 2016, which had continued, relatively speaking, unabated. And if you look at the 10-year period, he described about a 900% increase over the entire decade as in total." So what is the substrate to these horrific findings? As I mentioned, ADL has been polling anti-Semitism since 1964, but I want to take you through at least the last 2 decades quickly. And I do want to introduce the concept of triage. It was actually developed by a field surgeon, a French field surgeon, Rhode, during the Napoleonic period, and it was very simple principle, a very ethical principle, that you dealt with those that were most severely injured, regardless of class, and he said those dangerously wounded must be attended first entirely without regard to rank or distinction, and those less severely wounded must wait until the gravely hurt have been operated and addressed. So the nobleman's flesh wound would have to wait to be treated to the abdominal trauma that was experienced by a recruit that was shot in the stomach. So this is the example of the ADL index. And it's a very simple principle. The respondent is confronted with these statements, and then a positive or affirmative response is an anti-Semitic response. These are all tropes. You'll see if the first through 10, it's a positive response. That's the anti-Semitic response. The 11th, which is Jews are just as honest as other business people, is a positive response, would be saying no to that. And this can be a little bit confusing. So you'll see 10 years after this, the ADL changed the survey slightly. But it's the same principle, so that you have to, if you agree, if you give an anti-Semitic response to 6 out of the 11 statements, you become an index case of extreme anti-Semitism. And then what the ADL does is they just tally up how common this is in whatever population they're sampling, whether it's a nation, whether it's religious groups within a nation, et cetera. So I actually didn't know about those the survey data in 2004 when they came out. I learned of them 2 years later by reading this paper, which was a very striking paper in one respect. But it was a simple hypothesis. These were two well-known sociologic investigators, Edward Kaplan and Charles Small. And their hypothesis was that anti-Israel sentiment would predict anti-Semitism on this ADL scale. Now, the ADL in their survey, which I just showed you with those 11 statements, also included some information on anti-Israel sentiment. So these investigators got hold of the data and they published this paper, and they confirmed this very simple hypothesis that anti-Israel sentiment was predictive of anti-Semitism on the ADL scale. But what was most striking to me was that buried in a table in this paper was the fact that if you just looked at the anti-Semitism scale, relative to Christians, those professing Islam had almost an 8-fold increased risk of having extreme anti-Semitism on the ADL scale. And this was a very striking finding. And I remember actually seeing Charles Small in a meeting within a couple of months of when this paper was published. And I said, you know, this was a really striking finding. Why wasn't it your sort of headline finding? And he just sort of shrugged his shoulders. So I get a lot of shoulder shrugs. So here was the modified survey. What they basically did is they now made it a positive response to each one of these statements was the anti-Semitic response, and there was no, it was less confusing to the person that was being surveyed. But it's the same principle. 6 out of 11 characterizes the individual as a case of extreme anti-Semitism. And this was applied literally worldwide. So it's called the 100 Countries Survey. I think it was exactly 100 in this iteration. You'll see the more recent one was actually 103. But the most striking and obvious finding here was that the extreme anti-Semitism was uniquely elevated in countries, Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa. The prevalence went from anywhere from 74 to 93%. And this was a striking finding. Now, if you looked at the data globally, just with regard to religious affiliation, so Muslims versus Christians versus atheists, those with no religion, Hindus, Buddhists, you don't see those astronomical numbers that you see in the Muslims of the Middle East and North Africa when you look at Muslims overall, but it's still, the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism is still disproportionate amongst Muslims. Again, this is the entire data set, the entire world. So at least 2-fold more, up to 3-fold more than the other religious faiths. Now, the ADL has applied this scale within countries, moving to Western Europe and even the United States in the period basically between 2015 and 2023. And the most recent iteration included data from France. And there you can see, unfortunately, with the migrant population moving from North Africa to France, it's bringing, unfortunately, this baggage of extreme anti-Semitism with it. And it's disproportionate now amongst Muslim populations in Western Europe and even the United States. In France, it was 62% in 2023 in the 2023 release versus 15% amongst Christians or non-Muslims. The United States is a much more philo-Semitic country, but even here you see a disproportionate relative impact. You see 34%, this was from 2017, unfortunately I'm sure it's gotten worse, 34% amongst Muslims in 2017 versus 14% background rate amongst non-Muslims.
Because it doesn't count for radical
colonized Muslims. And since I think the US is 34% based on the non-Sunni population, but
No, that was just the Muslim population. The 14% is the background rate. So again, it's just the idea is that it was disproportionate wherever you looked. Obviously less than the extremes that you see in the Middle East and North Africa. And now, as these data show, a bad situation has gotten worse. These are data that were just released in mid-January of this year. And this was from 103 countries. Again, same ADL survey as I showed you from 2014. So this was roughly 90 countries where they sampled 500 and 13 countries where they sampled 1,000. But there's that same phenomenon in the Middle East and North Africa, very disproportionate. And I've shown you the North American and Western European countries on the right-hand side. And it's not to minimize those levels of anti-Semitism. It's just to show you the relative scale. If you look at the extremes, for example, the 97% in Kuwait versus the 8% in Canada, that's a 12-fold difference. And even at the lower end, if you look at the lowest prevalence in North Africa and the Middle East, in Qatar versus the highest, France, 13%, it's still fivefold. What's particularly ominous to me is what happened in Indonesia. And Indonesia is now, other than Kuwait and the West Bank, Gaza, the most anti-Semitic country in the world. And for many, many decades, you can hear the notion of a tolerant non-Arab Muslim Islam in Indonesia. And now the prevalence is 96%. And the ADL had them tallied at about 48% in 2014. So it's doubled, and very high rates in Turkey and Malaysia as well. So these are non-Arab Muslim countries. And so overall, about the top 19 countries in the world are all Muslim societies with the highest degrees of anti-Semitism. What's also disturbing about Indonesia is I remember reading a story in Ynet back in 2017, and there are only about 200 Asian Jews in Indonesia out of a population of almost 280 million. And yet they were threatened with death in this story if they dared to wear a kippah outside. And that was in 2017. So maybe the Indonesian findings in that, really are not that surprising. So why don't people know about these data? That's always troubled me. I got a live insight into why that might happen when Mort Klein was presenting at a conference at a hearing, I'm sorry, on hate, which included a discussion of anti-Semitism. This was back in 2019, and I helped Mort prepare some slides for his presentation. And because he was afraid that they wouldn't have, he wouldn't be able to show PowerPoint slides, he literally made placards and held them up. And irony of ironies, sitting right next to him during the hearing was none other than Candace Owens. And at that time, Mort told me she was very, very concerned, so she said, about anti-Semitism and wanted to know if there was anything she could do to help after he gave her presentation. So the world is full of ironies. But so Mort showed the data that I showed you from 2014. And the way these hearings go, there's a big hiatus between the different witnesses, and then the congressmen have to bloviate in between. But one witness who from the ADL, Eileen Hirschnov, was there, and she was very taken aback by Mort's just showing placards of ADL data, basically. That's all he did. And she wanted to apologize or rationalize them. And she says, one of the witnesses, Mort Klein, talked about global attitudes that we look at. And the ADL does track that. Vulnerable, marginalized communities have bigotry within them. And I'm like, I mean, it just made absolutely no sense. These are societies, with the exception of Lebanon, which is about 60% Muslim now. The rest of those societies with these astronomical rates of anti-Semitism are virtually exclusively Muslim. So they're not those are not vulnerable, marginalized, Muslim populations in those societies. But this is what they're left with, sort of this hand waving. But you got a more honest take in 2021 from Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO. This was, if you recall, there was an uptick in anti-Semitic activity in the United States with another another conflagration going on between Israel and Gaza that led to Operation Guardian of the Walls, that there was another incursion by the IDF, and there was some anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. And Greenblatt confessed, well, let's be clear, none of the people committing these crimes were wearing MAGA hats, right? We have people waving Palestinian flags and then beating Jewish people. So at some level, the ADL knows what's going on. But unfortunately, these are recent data. These are data presented by the American Jewish Committee, and they were released in February. Because of this, so the ADL shows the data at one level, at least in their reports, and then they interpret it in a very different way. The problem is really MAGA, the problem is Christian nationalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, people actually believe that. They don't look at the survey data themselves. So when the AJC published these data, these are from 2024, they released them just last month. Essentially, what Americans believed was that roughly 1/3 of American Jews say each of these four represents an equivalent, very serious anti-Semitic threat: extremism in the name of Islam, Christian nationalism, the extreme political left, and the extreme political right. And that has nothing to do with the reality of what actual anti-Semitic polling data show. So this process of warping people's sensibilities has occurred. So there aren't many data like this, like these. These are old, but it's the same theme. These are data from the European Union, and here 400 Jews that had been attacked or had been threatened with violence were asked to recall who they thought the perpetrator was. And the green bars pretty much tell the story, that they believed that disproportionately these were Muslim perpetrators. And it was about 2.2-fold the excess. And the next most common group was actually from the political left. If you look at the blue bars, there's a couple of outlying countries like Hungary where it was coming more from the right. And Hungary doesn't have a Muslim population. But again, the overall theme was that violent threats, when the Jewish victims were actually asked, were coming disproportionately from Muslims. Now, these are more recent data from the UK, and again, when the Jews were asked about who posed a very serious threat to them, this was not specifically asking about violence or violent threats, just the threat level overall. Here you see it, that it's both Islamists, so whatever radical Muslims, the far left and the far right, in that descending order. Now, I think there are validating data that come from the Muslim world. These data were put together by a Muslim think tank in Doha, Qatar. And here I pulled out two questions. Again, it's pretty striking. They were asked specifically about the attacks on October 7th, 2023. And essentially what you have here is a good representative sample of the entire Middle East and North Africa. About 500 per country, 16 countries. And they were surveyed a couple of months after the attacks, December into early January, December 2023 into early January 2024. And this particular question was, were the attacks a legitimate resistance operation? And the aggregate is 88% believe that. And it went from as high as 97% in Libya to the low in this group of 73% in Saudi Arabia. And then the other question that I pulled out was about rejecting Israel's right to exist or recognition of Israel as a sovereign state. And here again, the aggregate was extraordinarily high in the post-October 7th environment at 89%. So it's a different type of data, but they independently validate the data that I've shown you previously about anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, these were rather disturbing data collected in the United States. Within 2 weeks of the attacks on October 7th, 2023. Signal is known as a political pollster, but these data included attitudes, and amongst Muslim Americans, 58% agreed that the Hamas jihad attacks, this carnage, was quote unquote justified. So that's a disturbing figure, but it wasn't so great amongst Americans overall, which at about 25%, but still much higher in the Muslim population in the United States. Now, I'm glad there's a few young people here, younger people here, because these are really unique data that I think was very courageous of these Brandeis investigators, given what goes on campuses these days. So they tapped into this existing center that does surveys of college students, and it's like a clearinghouse, I guess. And they developed their own survey instrument. It was kind of like the ADL data that I've shown you. It assessed anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. And in this report, they focused on the non-Jewish respondents. So what they set out to do was look at campuses where there was a sizable Jewish representation, and then pull out the non-Jewish respondents. And they had over 3,800 of them. And so there were some somewhat reassuring findings from this study. So they concluded that although a climate of universal anti-Jewish hatred did not exist, Jewish student concerns about anti-Semitism were justified and driven by about a third of the students who held distinct patterns of beliefs about Jews and Israel. So they're saying 2/3 did not have these distinct patterns of beliefs, these distinctly anti-Semitic patterns of belief about Jews and Israel. But when they look at the most extreme group, and again, the reassuring thing is that this comprised only 2% of the entire sample. Only 2% had what they would define as extreme hatred on campus. That was defined basically as being both extremely anti-Israel and extremely anti-Semitic. That group, once again, was significantly overrepresented by the Muslim students. I'll take questions at the end. So it's very consistent with all the other data that I've shown you. So then the question arises, why? Let's dive in. If we look at Hamas's founding document, its covenant or charter, if you look at the very first statement in it, even before the preamble, it's a Quranic verse, but it's a very specific Quranic verse, which talks about the justification for the permanent degradation of the Jews because they are transgressors. They kill prophets. They engage in all kinds of nefarious activities to the detriment of Muslims and Islam. And it's striking that this is the first statement. The preamble goes on to extol the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas's historical connection to it. And then I pulled out 2 articles, and I'll show you why, because they relate to the polling data I'm going to show you. Article 7 in the Hamas covenant features a tradition of Muhammad, Islam's prophet, where he claims that the Jews have to be annihilated en masse to usher in the Messianic age. So it's end of times theology, what's called eschatology. Article 15 is a real world jihad and how the global Muslim community, or Ummah, has to join Hamas in waging a jihad to destroy Israel as a political entity. So you could look at Article 7 as basically genocidal, Article 15 is politicidal. It's destruction of the state of Israel. So Stanley Greenberg, who is very well known as a political pollster for the Clintons, for both Hillary and Bill Clinton, for their presidential campaigns, et cetera. I think her senatorial campaign. But he's a very respected Democratic pollster. He did something remarkable. He developed a survey instrument that included specific questions pulled right out of the Hamas covenant in Arabic, and went to the West Bank and Gaza, and in face-to-face Arabic interviews, his researchers interviewed over 1,000 Palestinian Muslims, and the findings again are very disturbing. When given a quote from the Hamas charter that has to do with Article 15 and this idea that the global Muslim community must join together in a jihad to destroy Israel as a political entity, 80% agreed with those sentiments. And then referring to language in Article 7, which is this tradition of Muhammad for end of times, about the Jews being annihilated to the person to bring in the end of times, 73% agreed with those sentiments. So these are very dark, deeply held religious beliefs. Now, I was curious about something that was brought to my attention. I'm sure many of you are aware of what's taken place in Syria. It's really about the end of an 80-year process of this struggle between some of the secular forces and the fundamentalist Islamic elements of Syrian society, and where the pendulum has swung to where the more secular elements, some of the minority groups, the Alawites, the Christians, not that they treated when they were in power, they were quite brutal themselves, but they've been defeated, and now you're seeing mass atrocities being committed against the Christians and the Alawites by these jihadists that have taken control of Syria and basically, are converting it into an Islamic state. So there was a piece in the Jerusalem Post published January 4th, and I don't know why, but they were focusing on some of the changes that were going to be taking place in the Syrian education system. And the language I immediately recognized, because the article said the changes include, quote, those who are damned and who have gone astray to Jews and Christians. And what the article didn't tell you is that's a Quranic verse. That's from the opening surah or chapter of the Quran. It's the 7th verse. So just for background, the Quran is the reason that it's difficult for non-Muslims when they pick it up and translate it, in a solid translation in whatever their language is, and it's translated into languages across the world. But let's say you're picking up an English translation. The reason it's difficult to follow, the narrative is difficult to follow, is because it doesn't have a linear narrative organizing principle. It's basically longest to shortest. So if you look at the 114 surahs or chapters 2 to 114, with minor exceptions, are literally longest to shortest. The opening surah, which I'm going to talk about, is very short. So it violates this principle, and it was just sort of spatchcocked on at the end. That's what's believed. And it's actually a pretty benign verse. The first 6 verses are just about the glory and magnanimity of Allah, but the 7th verse turns dark again, because Muslims are told that they should follow the path of those upon whom you, Allah, has bestowed favor, which means the Muslims, not of those who have evoked your anger or those who are astray. So again, what are those allusions? A tradition of Muhammad spells out what those allusions are. It's the Jews who've incurred Allah's anger and the Christians who've gone astray. And not only is it in this tradition, if you look at the pool of Quranic commentaries, literally spanning the early classical period and now, till now, I'm giving you an example of one. Those Quranic commentaries, about 90% of them, interpret this verse that way, that incurring anger refers to the Jews and going astray refers to the Christians. And it's a very negative form of indoctrination, because the whole short surah is repeated about 17 times a day by pious Muslims within their 5 prayer sessions, and then within subdivisions of the prayer sessions. And just to give you an example of a modern authoritative interpretation, this comes from Muhammad Sayyid Tantawi, who was the Grand Imam. I'll talk about him a little bit more. From 1996 to when he died suddenly in 2010. And he says, those who've incurred Allah's anger are the Jews, and those who are misguided are the Christians. This interpretation comes from Muhammad. And he goes on to describe what it is about the Jews that caused them to incur Allah's anger. So that brings me, because Tantawi was a Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, I think it's important to understand the power of Al-Azhar University. It is, yes, you hear this all the time about how Islam doesn't really have a central authority. Yes and no. This is the closest you would get to a central authority, to a Vatican or near Vatican equivalent. And Sunni Islam represents 90% of Muslims, and Al-Azhar has been that Vatican-like equivalent. It was founded in 972, but it didn't really achieve prominence until the period of Saladin, the famous Muslim conqueror who defeated the Crusader kingdom. And its Grand Imams are essentially papal equivalents. But if you look at, not Hamas now, we're moving away from a group that's considered jihadist and radical, etc. This is as mainstream as it gets in Islam. Al-Azhar University, certainly Sunni Islam. It's absurd to consider Al-Azhar radical by Muslim standards. So if you look at fatwas that sound very much like Hamas, fatwas that declared jihad against all the Jews, I just outlined for you an arc that goes back to 1947. So in 1947, upon the announcement of the partition plan, there is no Israel. It's a theoretical construct at this point. But just upon the announcement of the partition, fatwa is issued, to the global Muslim community. Of course, at the outset of the War of Independence in 1948, 9 months before the Sinai War, at the outset of the 1967 war. And what I'm highlighting is two. I'm going to show you what happened in 1968 in this worldwide Muslim conference on jihad and anti-Semitism. Another fatwa at the outset of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And what I'm going to show you is even literally a pronouncement was issued on the day of the October 7th attacks, but more importantly, a formal fatwa was issued within 2 weeks of those attacks by Al-Azhar. So what happened in 1968? This is really important. So if you recall, the 6-Day War was a catastrophic defeat for the Israel's Arab Muslim neighbors. And a conference was held, organized again by Al-Azhar University, in the aftermath of that resounding defeat. And it was literally an invitation to Muslims from across the globe to come in and to listen to lectures by all these major theologians who are drawn from the Arab world, but well beyond it as well. And they produced a 935-page conference proceeding, which was actually translated into English. And a mentor of mine, a dear mentor of mine who passed in 2012, David Littman, who's a British historian, he was reading this in a library in London, and it was just jaw-dropping. And he decided that no one's going to read 935 pages. So he put together what he thought were the highlights from it, and produced a little monograph called Arab Theologians on Jews in Israel. And the first edition, I think, came out in 1971. And I eventually photocopied the entire 935 page proceedings, and I went through it. It was not pleasant to go through it. But I agreed. I wanted to see it for myself. I agreed with David's assessment of it, and he said these were the 6 key recurring themes from this conference, this global conference held in Cairo under the aegis of Al-Azhar. Jews are frequently denoted as the enemies of Allah. Jews manifest in themselves an historical continuity of evil qualities that's described in the Quran. Jews do not constitute a true people or nation. The state of Israel is the culmination of the historical and cultural depravity of the Jews. It has to be destroyed by a jihad. The superiority of Islam over all other religions is brandished as a guarantee that the Arabs will ultimately triumph. It is outrageous for the Jews, traditionally kept by Arab Islam in a humiliated, inferior status and characterized as cowardly, to defeat the Arabs, have their own state, and cause the contraction of the abode of Islam, the so-called Dar al-Islam, which is basically all the territories that were ever conquered in jihad campaigns, which date back to the period right after Muhammad's supposed death in 632. And there was a lightning expansion in the first 100 years after his death under the so-called rightly guided caliphs. But the most ominous thing that David wanted to summarize was that, you know, this monotonous litany of lectures featuring and focusing relentlessly on jihadism and Jew hatred. He was afraid that they could lead to the urge to liquidate Israel, politicize, so the political destruction of Israel, and the Jews, genocide. If the evil of the Jews is immutable and permanent, transcending time and circumstances, and impervious to all hopes of reform, there is only one way to cleanse the world of them: by their complete annihilation. And you can imagine in 1971 for David to write something like this, it was extremely controversial. And when the Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, some of the academics who had sort of poo-pooed what he wrote came back to him and said, gee, maybe there was something to your analysis. So I mentioned earlier, I brought up Grand Imam Tantawi. He not only served as Grand Imam of Al-Azhar for 14 years, he's arguably the most important modern Sunni Quranic commentator. And just to show you, during his tenure as Grand Imam, I'll give you extracts from an early work that he wrote as his PhD thesis. I'm going to produce a full translation of it. It's 766 pages in Arabic, and it's been fully translated, and I'm just annotating it and introducing it, and hopefully it'll come out by the end of the year. But even as Grand Imam, he referred to the Jews as enemies of Allah, descendants of apes and pigs. By the way, the apes and pigs reference is in the 5th surah of the Quran, the 60th verse. Jews as apes alone is repeated twice at 265 and 7166. And in that same month, if you recall the horrific Netanya Passover homicide bombings on March 27th, even after them, he sanctioned homicide bombings against all Israelis, including non-combatants. Now I'm not going to go through all of this for you, but just to show you, I was curious if his PhD thesis, which came out in 1968, in comparison to his sort of mature Quranic commentary, which is a huge 10-volume work, I was hoping maybe there would be some mellowing over that period of time, but my hopes were dashed. With a version of his PhD thesis from '68 was reissued in 1997, so a year after he became Grand Imam, and it'll come out when I produce the translation, publish the translation. He opens up the 1997 version of this 1968 PhD thesis, talking about how he still believes in everything he wrote in his PhD thesis, and the Quranic commentary in the interim shows that he hadn't changed. But I want to read for you, which is a consistent summary of his interpretation. And again, very authoritative, not a Hamasnik, not a Hezbollahnik, Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University. The Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, i.e. killing the prophets of Allah, and I've given you Quranic references, corrupting his words, Allah's words, by putting them in the wrong places, consuming the people's wealth frivolously, refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do, and other ugly characteristics caused by their deep-rooted lascivious envy. Only a minority of the Jews keep their word. All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims. This is in Quran 3:113. The bad ones do not. The Jews always remain maleficent deniers. They should desist from their negative denial. Some Jews went way overboard in their denying hostility, so gentle persuasion can do no good with them. And this is where it gets really ominous. So use force with them and treat them in the way you see as effective in ridding them of their evil. One may go so far as to ban their religion, their persons, their wealth, and their villages. So who's his successor? So I mentioned he died suddenly in 2010. He died of a heart attack, actually. I believe he was in Saudi Arabia at the time. Ahmed Al-Tayeb is still the Grand Imam currently, and his tenure began in 2010 shortly after Tantawi's death. So before he became Grand Imam, he sanctioned homicide bombing himself against all Israeli Jews in 2007. As Grand Imam in 2014 and 2018, he claimed that Israel had created ISIS and the other jihadist groups that were ravaging the Middle East, and it was all a Zionist plot. He also, it sounds really bizarre, but this allegation is actually kind of ancient. But he just updated it that the Zionist entity will march on the Kaaba, that central stone structure in the Holy Mosque in Mecca, and on the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. This is on their minds and in their hearts. And then, of course, he also states, in the same time period, that of course the issue of anti-Semitism is a lie. So it's a little bit of cognitive dissonance there. And twice he's given interviews on national television where he gives his own sort of Quranic exegesis, Quranic interpretation of this central anti-Semitic verse in the Quran. This was from the 2013 interview. He says, a verse in the Quran explains the Muslims' relations with the Jews. This is an historical perspective which has not changed to this day. See how we suffer from global Zionism and Judaism. Since the inception of Islam 1400 years ago, we have been suffering from Jewish and Zionist interference in Muslim affairs. This is a cause of great distress for the Muslims. The Quran said it, and history has proven it. And then he cites the opening of this verse in the Quran, which is kind of a psychological transfers verse. It says, you shall find the strongest among men in enmity to the believers, to the Muslims, to be the Jews. So I mentioned Al-Azhar's litany of fatwas and how it was really a continuum right into the present. Literally on the day of the attacks, Al-Azhar issued a statement. They mentioned nothing about the tragic carnage of the residents of southern Israel, but celebrated the carnage committed by Hamas as the resistance efforts of the proud Palestinian people. But then by October 18th, 19th, on different social media platforms that came out about 24 hours apart, they issued a formal fatwa like these previous ones dating back to 1947, which targeted all Israelis as Zionist settlers and saying they were all legitimate targets of jihad. So again, the sentiment is identical in theology to what you're getting from Hamas or Hezbollah, but it's coming. The horrific thing is that it's coming from an institution that trains imams that fan out across the world and is still arguably the most important religious teaching center in the Sunni Muslim world. And I guess the other phenomenon, I'll talk about this a little more, is that you don't get any pushback to this. You don't get non-Muslim religious leaders, particularly Jews, denouncing this. It's a very disturbing thing to watch. This was just to show you that it's not just current Grand Imam Al-Tayeb. that commented in this way about the carnage on October 7th. They had the dean of the Faculty of Islamic and Arabic Studies at Al-Azhar, the current inspector general of Al-Azhar, citing Quranic verses that are very negative towards the Jews and reaffirming them, essentially, including the apes and pigs verse and Jews as murderers of prophets. Getting back to Tayeb, he was still angry about the partition plan from 1947. So on its anniversary this past November, on November 29th of 2024, he reaffirmed that as far as he's concerned, representing Al-Azhar, they still reject it. And that is again is one of the earlier iterations of the two-state solution. And then of course, jumping ahead to the morass that we're living with now with Syria, that too, of course, was a Zionist plot. And he used language that I had not heard used by Sunni clerics. I've heard it by the Ayatollahs from Iran, the Shiite clerics, Khamenei, that Israel and Jews, Judaism were a cancer that must be prevented from spread into the Arab Muslim body. Now, I wanted to bring something up that just happened last Thursday night. And again, put it back in the perspective of the current Grand Imam, although this was not him. So on Al-Azhar's website, I noticed I guess I noticed it Friday, but it was from the previous evening. They have every day at the end of the day, sundown, they have prayer sessions, and they have, I didn't realize this, they have this tradition. I don't know how long it's been going on. They have a prayer session right out in front of Al-Azhar University and its mosque. And lo and behold, and this is purely gratuitous, there are some Quranic references to Ramadan. This ain't one of them. This is just a purely anti-Semitic verse that I've mentioned to you before. And I was just like, this is what they're reciting, on the seventh evening of Ramadan, So I have done a whole sort of riff on this, and I put it up at my website. We translated it, but all he was doing was reading the opening of the verse and in an incantation. And I just put up on the right to remind you that here is how the current Grand Imam interprets this verse. So it's a very, very anti-Semitic verse. And again, totally gratuitous, has nothing to do with Ramadan per se, but it had to be put out there last Thursday night. So here is a summary evaluation of hundreds of U.S. mosque sermons after October 7th, 2023. The Middle East Media Research Institute has had various projects for reform in the Arab and Muslim world. This is a Saudi, Mansour al-Hajj, who is a pious Muslim, but he was assigned, given his fluency, given his religious training, to study hundreds of Friday mosque sermons across the U.S. after October 7th. And it was a very, very honest and I'm sure uncomfortable report for him to make. And he just talked about the use of many of these themes that I've introduced to you being reiterated over and over again in mosque sermons across the United States since October 7th. No mention of the carnage that was inflicted upon the population in southern Israel. He concluded these preachers and imams focused on highlighting the similarities between Hamas's attack and the wars fought by the Prophet, by Muhammad, and his companions, demonizing Israel, narrating anti-Semitic stories attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam, such as the Hadith about the stones in the Gar country, that comes right out of the Hamas covenant, and citing verses from the Quran, some of which I've given you examples of, that characterize Jews as corrupt, treacherous, untrustworthy, and the killers of prophets. And I just included a little note at the bottom. I remember some years ago reading a story that I found fascinating. It was published in 1996 in the Washington Post, and it was still online. It was about a Black American convert to Islam who went on to become an assassin. And he was writing his memoirs, and he talked about how he first converted to Islam. He was living near a mosque, and he could hear a sermon, literally booming through his walls, and he was just fascinated by this. And it turned out to be Saeed Ramadan, who was a very famous Muslim scholar and Muslim brother, and an ally of the godfather of the Palestinian Arab Muslim movement, Haj Amin al-Hassani. And he was also recruited by the Eisenhower administration when there was this period in the 50s where Islam was seen as a bulwark against communism. And Saeed Ramadan was part of that outreach. So this Black American went on to convert to Islam under Saeed Ramadan directly, and became friendly and a confidant. And what was he preaching back in 1975? A jihad against the Jews in Israel. So it's not a new phenomenon, even in the United States. And so several years, 4 years before this analysis that Memory did of the post October 7th sermons, Yigal Carmon was already very concerned. He's the director of the Middle East Media Research Institute, and I think he said something that is so important and holds to this day. He says, a lot of the incitement actually deteriorated into threats of violence based on Islamic texts, the primary basic Islam of the time of Muhammad. And then this is the part that is truly tragic, and I would say to some extent reprehensible. The Jewish communities, who are the direct victim of the direct target of this incitement, are afraid to do anything, not protest, not public action, not anything. They are afraid of being considered Islamophobic. So this smear of Islamophobia, and I'm going to give you a local example, and that's how we'll finish up, is powerful. It's powerful. I would say it's crippling. And our leadership, as Jews, as individuals, we damn well better get over it, because it's nonsense. One more thing before I get to local situations. This was again, I say unbelievable, but maybe the every day something else becomes unbelievable. This was less than a month ago. I don't know if you recall this. There was just throngs of Muslims marching into Borough Park, and Borough Park is the most iconic Orthodox Hasidic Jewish community in the world outside of Israel. It's an enormous, and it's actually a fascinating place. My wife and I used to drive through it every day when we lived in Queens and commuted to SUNY downstate when we were in medical school. And right on the street, and Memory, give Memory credit. Memory captured this scene of some, I don't know who it is, but one of the demonstrators getting up in the middle of this Orthodox Jewish community and saying in Arabic, Memory translated it, "Oh Allah, annihilate the plundering Zionists. Oh Allah, annihilate the criminal Zionists. Oh Allah, kill them one by one, count them one by one, and do not leave a single one of them." I mean, right in the middle of this iconic Jewish neighborhood. And yeah, there were some tepid condemnations of the march in general, but this is what needed to be condemned directly. And I didn't see that coming from anybody other than Memory indirectly by reporting it. So what's going on here in Rhode Island? The Masjid al-Islam, the Mosque al-Islam in North Smithfield, and its Imam Ikram al-Haq, and there he is in all his glory. Right again, very shortly after October 7th, put up this angry Facebook posting. And by the way, it's kind of a dormant account. I don't know why this is still up there, but there's basically nothing else. And no recent sermons. I'll show you the mosque in Providence is very different. Every Friday, by like clockwork, you can go and see their sermons. You can watch them live on Facebook. And they're archived immediately. So he says on October 19, 2023, so less than 2 weeks after October 7th, may Allah crush the hands of oppressors, killers, and murderers who have killed thousands of children. Israel had barely responded at this point, by the way. Women and men in Gaza. How sad and pathetic is the state of hypocrisy of world leaders who are unwilling, well, that's his typo, incapable, he meant to write, to exert their power to stop the massacre and genocide unfolding for the last 10 days. Human blood is very sacred in the sight of Allah, and he is certainly watching all the actions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who is this guy? Well, I just through doing some searching, in his own descriptions of who he is and where he trained. He went to Pakistan. I assume he's of Pakistani origin, and he trained under the supervision of someone who's actually very famous, a Muslim jurist named Taqi Usmani, who himself is the son of a former Grand Mufti of Pakistan. Well, I was very familiar with Taqi Usmani because I read his book, Islam and Modernism. And in the closing chapter of that book, he urges Muslims to wage jihad against their non-Muslim host societies when they're powerful enough to do so. And this really, he was interviewed, so there's a huge Pakistani diaspora population in the UK. And so he was interviewed, I think it was in 2007, by a correspondent from the Times of London. And when he confronted Usmani with his writings in this book, Usmani was, yeah, that's what I believe. And obviously that had implications for British society, and you're seeing some of that now, unfortunately. But he was very unabashed in his discussion, and I remember the argument was that offensive jihad, jihad for conquest, is open-ended. It's not over. It's not something that's relegated, to the history books or to the theoretical theology. It's active and live. So what's been going on at the Masjid Al-Karim, the Islamic Center of Rhode Island? This is actually a very fascinating story, and I'll spend a little time and close out on this. So I don't think this mosque got much attention until November 17th of 2027. And on that day, and this literally becomes, I have now come to call it, and I'm sorry if it sounds too flip, but you'll hear the whole story and maybe you'll agree with me. I've now come to call it the shot in the tuchus heard around the world. Because what happened was a Muslim in Muslim garb who sells Muslim paraphernalia, that too is an interesting story, every Friday, drives down from Maine to do this, by the way, had I think 4 or 5 rounds. I got the police report by an APRA request, and so I could really understand what on earth happened. So 4 or 5 rounds were fired at him, and fortunately for him, I mean, he was targeted. This was a murder attempt. He literally was just superficially wounded in his buttocks, and he was out. He was dealt with. I don't even know if he was actually admitted, but he was dealt with, and he was recovered very quickly. But of course, the local press, egged on by the Council on American Islamic Relations, turned this into an Islamophobic shooting before there was even an investigation. And by the time of this report, the one that I posted up here, it said, the headline is "A week after shooting outside a Providence mosque, Rhode Island's Muslim community wonders why." Well, the whole implication of that story, again, this is 10 days later, is that it's an Islamophobic shooting. And in that article, in the Projo, you can see that one of the police majors says, we have no evidence as of now that it's an Islamophobic shooting. But it doesn't matter to the reporters. And the UK Guardian picked up this story, CNN picked up this story, Islamophobic shooting. And that's where it stands, you know, to this day, despite the fact that when you get the the police report, and they're always updating the police reports. Um, it turns out that the victim has a significant criminal history, including being he had a 20-year sentence for not only selling drugs but for manufacturing them. Somehow he got out after 5 years. That's the victim. The primary suspect, her, is and he's named. There's a warrant to search in his apartment and get his cell phone, et cetera, et cetera. When once they name him, you can look up his criminal record. This is a very sad story. He's only 23 years old. He's in the ACI now on a different offense. And he has just a litany of offenses, weapons, drugs, et cetera, et cetera. He's the only suspect in this case. And here we are all these months later. It's never been determined to be an Islamophobic shooting. In fact, what it just looks like is a shooting between two Muslims who had some beef, potentially given their criminal histories, over drugs. That would be the most logical, you know, conclusion to this. However, because of, you know, we all have Fifth Amendment protections in this country, neither the victim nor the alleged perpetrator, who is in prison now, have any incentive to talk, and the investigation is stalled. But to this date, it's not considered to be an Islamophobic shooting by the people investigating it, and has never been declared to be so. It did make it into a state resolution, a House resolution on Islamophobia that was put out at the end of February of last year. That, and if you heard about the shooting of a Brown student in Burlington, Vermont, who is now sadly a paraplegic, those two incidents were cited in this Islamophobia resolution. That crime, they know exactly who the perp is. It's going through the legal system in Burlington. That crime is not even being prosecuted as a hate crime anymore. It turns out that the known perpetrator there, and there's no dispute who the perpetrator was a left winger with a history of favorable social media postings about Hamas, who was known to be really deranged for many years, and does not fit the profile of some sort of, you know, skinhead neo-Nazi Islamophobe. He was actually an organic farmer, but just has been having severe mental health problems for a number of years now. And even in Burlington, Vermont, which is rather woke, they're not pursuing this even as a hate crime. Yet you have this resolution, and it was you see Jewish representatives on the resolution in the Rhode Island House, who put these two instances into their resolution and CC'd it to the mosque, to the Brown student that tragically is a paraplegic now, and to the Council on American Islamic Relations, almost like in deference to them. It's just absolutely outrageous. And here's the resolution. I just gave you an example of it. So what's actually going on at this mosque? So I was asked back in December when I spoke at the Barrington Public Library in the Q&A. Had I ever, because of all of, I was presenting various materials from mosque sermons or summarizing them, et cetera. Had I ever, you know, listened to any sermons or witnessed any, been in person witnessing any sermons in Rhode Island? And I had to admit I hadn't. So I started to after, and the first one I listened to was right after the vehicular jihad carnage in New Orleans on New Year's Day of this year. And so if you recall, that was a Wednesday. So the sermon immediately after that was on the following Friday. And I could not believe what I was listening to. And a lot of it was in English, but then there was what they call a supplication in Arabic at the end, and I had to. It was so disturbing to me. I work with a friend who has an AI program, and you get a decent translation, but there's always questions about it. So I've been working with a translator on this big translation project. I sent it to him, sent the clip to him to listen to. There's another colleague of mine who is actually a rabbi who interesting, very interesting and unique, trained, studied Arabic in Cairo. And I sent it to him. And then a colleague of mine in Canada works with a former IDF intel guy who used to translate in real time for the IDF. And we sent, and the three of them agreed that on the final product that we produced. But it was absolutely shocking. You know, the part that I could understand, and it was in English with some Quranic references that I knew instantly, was again, this is 2 days after New Orleans. So there's a discussion about the solidarity of the global Muslim community and the fact that it's the best community in the world. That's a standard theme in the Quran in the third surah. But there was also this strange thing about nationalism. And the imam, it's this guy pictured, and he's responsible for these sermons, all of these sermons. And I don't know his name. And even I've asked police intel, and they don't know his name either, which is also curious. He was denouncing he didn't even mention like Western nationalism, like US nationalism or Western. He didn't like Saudi nationalism. He didn't like Pakistani nationalism. He didn't like Egyptian nationalism because it gets in the way of this concept of a solidary global entity, an ummah. And then he goes from that to invoking this Quranic verse, which I instantly recognized, about how Muhammad tells Muslims that they should be merciful amongst themselves, but harsh to the disbelievers. 2 days after New Orleans. So I'm like, this is not good. But then there was, I could recognize a few words in the supplication, and I was like, I think he's calling for jihad. And lo enough, that's what he was doing. The end of the supplication essentially boiled down to a call to fight the disbelievers and the polytheists. I mean, this is 2 days after New Orleans. But again, you know, I presented all these sermons. I'll get to the other two before I tell you who I presented this to. If you remember, may not remember, I didn't remember. In 2023, Christmas oddly fell on a Monday. It was celebrated on a Monday, and the Friday before that was the 22nd. I'm listening in English, the one language I can understand, and I know exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about the Muslim Jesus 3 days before Christmas. I'm like, why now? Well, I guess there's a reason why. It's such a negative. It's so insulting to Christians because essentially the Muslim Jesus, Isa, is and you hear this nonsense about how, you know, Islam cherishes Jesus. You know, it's not a character that has anything to do with the gospel narrative of Jesus. Isa is a Muslim prophet, and as the Imam makes clear, he will come back before the end of times to destroy Christianity, to convert all Christians, and those who aren't willing to convert, the other option is death. But I was like, why do this 3 days, you know, before Christmas? But he did it, and in that same sermon, he went to invoke some Quranic anti-Semitism from the 17th surah, from the second surah, and he's accusing the Jews of genocide in Gaza, reminding Muslims that Jews are corrupted and they're to be punished and they're prophet killers. But a worse sermon occurred just a few weeks later from the same imam. You know, and I'll talk about the genocide in a second. After explaining Surah 1, which I introduced to you, it's that very short chapter at the opening of the Quran, which talks at the end, at the 7th verse, about the Jews having incurred Allah's anger. He describes that as the most glorious verse in the Quran. And before he goes into reminding them that it's the Jews who've incurred Allah's anger, and they've been cursed, and they've been accused of prophet killing. And then he says, he connects those thoughts to that it's the Jews. He doesn't mention the IDF. He doesn't mention Israel, who are committing a genocide in Gaza because of their inveterate evil nature. If they can kill their own prophets, of course, it's nothing for them to kill Muslims in a genocidal way in Gaza. And it's just absolutely outrageous. I want to summarize, but before I get to that, so just so people can understand that there is no genocide. There was no genocide. There is no genocide in Gaza. I actually went, I didn't know this, but the US Census does census collects census information across the world. We pay for it. We should know about it. The population of Gaza increased by over 2% in 2023 and increased by over 2% again in 2024. So it's grown. Populations don't grow during an actual genocide. The other thing is that so there's talk about starvation, and that is a form of genocide. The supplies sent into Gaza, can't account for what happens to them once they are delivered, but the supplies sent into Gaza are well beyond the standard for delivering food and nutrients to a conflict zone or an area affected by a natural disaster. Well beyond anywhere from 140 to roughly to 180%. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense when you hear these allegations. So, basic conclusions. Please, I wish there were more of you here, but whoever's here, please share the basic data. It is shocking to me how Jews, and it's because of our rotten community leadership. I'm sorry, it's just that's what it is. These are not Islamophobic data; they're data. When you want to identify a problem, you have to see where it's most severe. These data are not subtle. It's overwhelmingly in our era. I'm not talking about all eras. Now, for sure, and quantifiably so. It is overwhelmingly a Muslim problem. I have yet to hear this discussed by any mainstream organization. Even the ADL, which produces these data, would never hold a forum like the first half of what I presented you, let alone the second half, but the first half. They don't do it. The Greater Jewish Alliance of Rhode Island doesn't do it. Across the spectrum politically, it is just not done. I find it mind-boggling. How do you understand a problem without quantifying it first? So this absolutely share these data. They're not Islamophobic data. They're data, period. The other thing that's not discussed, as I gave you an example just from less than a week ago, last Thursday night, is that when Al-Azhar University, again, the Sunni Islam Vatican equivalent, imagine, let's fast forward a little over a month, Roland, Christmas, I'm sorry, Easter week. Imagine, it'll never happen, but imagine if by some bizarre fluke it happened that you, outside of St. Peter's Basilica, during Easter week, a group of cardinals just started to spontaneously recite the worst anti-Semitic screed from the ancient church fathers. There would be an upheaval from the Jewish community leadership decrying how just this disgusting spectacle taking place during a very probably the most important Christian holiday or time of year. This, what I showed you out in front of Al-Azhar University, it passes unnoticed, let alone condemned. So the constant repetition of these themes from the most authoritative institutions to the local mosque has to be routinely not only identified, memory identifies it, but what's not happening is that all these sermons, hundreds and hundreds of them, I'm talking about in the United States, not just overseas, very few, if any, are publicly condemned. Every single one should be condemned. Every one that's out there should be accompanied by a press release within a few days or a week that's condemning it from the ADL, from the AJC, from local communities where it's occurring. I cannot get the Greater Jewish Alliance to say anything about this mosque in Providence. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear about it. And this is a shanda. That's their most fundamental responsibility. They're afraid. They're afraid of being smeared as Islamophobes is the only thing I can think of. And so just finally, the last thing I want to say is, and this is very theoretical, but there was a process, particularly in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, but it actually began before the Holocaust, of radically reforming Christian theology, particularly again from the Catechism, from the Church Fathers, and expunging in particular the deicide allegation, the idea that it was the Jews that killed Jesus and they're cursed forever on that basis. That was altered formally in Christian teaching. And the movement began before World War II amongst, believe it or not, French clerics. It was catalyzed by a Jew, Jules Isaac, who was a hero in World War I. He was wounded in Verdun, and during the war, he lost half his family. And he knew about this movement before the war, and he saw how important it was in the wake of the Holocaust. He joined these French clerics and pointed out to them that just like in the Old Testament, the New Testament, it's the Word of God. You're not gonna get changes to that, but what you can get are changes to all the man-made interpretations of that text. And this is what Isaac imparted to this very noble group of French clerics, and in concert they went to two successive popes. And you got at least the Vatican II idea, and it's being celebrated this year. It's the 60th anniversary. It's an imperfect process. All these things are, but it's changed. And frankly, as an epidemiologist, I see some of it reflected in the data that we're seeing now. Sure, there's still Christian anti-Semitism, and it can be pretty virulent at times, but it pales in comparison to what we're seeing from the left and what we're seeing from Islam. And we have the data to show for that now. So something good, came out of it. And that's what needs to be demanded of Islam's teaching institutions. And that, of course, again, silence from the Jewish community and silence from the non-Muslim religious community in general. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
Can you elaborate more that here in Islamic society, the least decades ago, even before the 60s, Christians evolved to first wanted to move to Israel, and then he became more
As far as I know about Baldwin, he didn't convert to Islam. I mean, there's yeah, right.
So first, as you mentioned about Islam, anti-Semites here in the States, how many of them, or what percentage of the Black Americans, Muslims, that influence all these decades to
yeah, so right. Oh, so you know, the Black community in this country is diverse. First of all, there's a strong, very philo-Semitic movement in some of the Black churches, which is wonderful to behold. As a matter of fact, I know of a group that's working with a colleague of mine, Charles Jacobs, that is pointing out to the Black community that Arab Muslim enslavement of Blacks is still taking place in Africa. And you know, it comes as shocking to the larger, you know, Black community. Even you can still find it. The not Eldridge Cleaver, who wrote Soul on Ice. Um, when when the um, when the original UN resolution, Zionism is racism came out in the mid 1970s. He was in prison at the time. Eldridge Cleaver wrote a wonderful op-ed, and it's just saying how absurd that was, and that his experience, you know, he was a Black radical communist, whatever. He went through that period. He became an entrepreneur later in life. But he described how he spent time in Algeria with the radicals in Algeria, and he said that the Algerians still own slaves, Black slaves, when he was there in Algeria, and that he had found in his experience that talk about racism, that the Arabs that he interacted with were amongst the most racist people in the world, and how dare they accuse the Jews of being racist when they still own slaves. So there are efforts like this to educate, you know, the Black community, but unfortunately, you know, Malcolm X was virulently anti-Semitic. He, in his biography, you can read how he extolled Haj Amin al-Husseini. He got to meet him apparently in Saudi Arabia. It's problematic. I gave you the example of that black convert to Islam, who was inspired by Saeed Ramadan, you know, a Muslim brother, in the mid 1970s, and ultimately not only converted to Islam but became an assassin. You know, so it's problematic. It's you know, and you're seeing now, not just the you know, the bizarre but virulently anti-Semitic sort of Nation of Islam movement. You're seeing particularly with Malcolm X moved away from Nation of Islam. He became a mainstream Sunni Muslim. So those examples are bad examples, you know, for the Black community, and there's a duality to it, because they're seen as legitimate civil rights leaders, but they carry this baggage with them that's very anti-Semitic. So I would say the counterbalance to that is coming from the traditional Black churches that haven't been co-opted by the left, and those are natural allies. Pardon?
Black communities before the last 20 years of the immigration drive. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, it does go back pretty far. It goes back to Malcolm X. I mean, that's the 1950s, so it's not just the last couple of decades. That's a while now. Yeah.
There was a big movement where these imams were going into the jails and converting.
Oh yeah. That's an issue. I can tell you. I can't tell you exactly how I have it sourced, but I can tell you confidently that's a big issue with the Islamic Center of Rhode Island in Providence, which I presented. Is that it's got a big prison convert component to the problem. That's as far as I'll go.
A lot of the famous sports people.
Yeah.
Black
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Lou Alcindor, yeah, Muhammad Ali. Right. Cassius Clay. Yeah. Yeah, so it brings baggage with it. Yes, in the back.
Why do you think the left, which is traditionally, pro-Israel, and why do you think they have turned so anti-Israel and
Depends how left you want to go. This is your Mark? Right, Mark. Marx, if you're not familiar, was an absolutely Hitlerian anti-Semite. So that element has always existed, in the far left. And it's fascinating. I don't know if you're familiar, Mark, with this book that has come out about the Hebron pogrom by Yardena Schwartz. If you've seen her give talks about it. But one of the, it's a very good book. I would buy, and hopefully maybe we'll get her to speak. It's an important book. It's a very useful book. But one of the things that I discovered, and she didn't touch on this. She did a very good job of talking about the jihadism and relating it to what took place on October 23rd. That's sort of the crux of her analysis. But what I was shocked to see was that you're talking about the left. When the atrocities were reported, Morning Freiheit, which was the Yiddish communist newspaper, I wouldn't say it wasn't Jewish, it was communist. Morning Freiheit had these cartoons that looked like, and this is 1929, they looked exactly like Julius Streicher cartoons that would come out a few years later during the Nazi regime, virulently anti-Semitic cartoons. Okay, so one of the what
amazing phenomenon.
Right.
The last 2 years, I've seen campuses and leftists.
Well, okay, so here's an insight that I found very helpful, because there's been a lot of emphasis on DEI, and its negative effects. And here's how I think it ties into pedagogy on Islam. So in my first book, which was about jihadism, the legacy of jihad, I came across a very interesting scholar in researching that book, who was an anti-Zionist, a Jew, nominally Jewish, an anti-Zionist, a communist, and later on, renounced communism. Unfortunately, I don't ever see any statements from him where he renounced his anti-Zionism. However, all along, he was a measured and I think a somewhat thoughtful scholar of Islam. That was his main area of academics. In 1974, he contributed an essay to something called The Legacy of Islam. And he noticed how, so the phenomenon had been going on for a while already. He said he noticed that there were conversions to Islam in the academic left and the post-colonial left. And he said that their scholarship, not only the ones that had converted, obviously with them, but the scholarship in general on Islam from the post-colonial left, as he described it all the way back then, 50 years ago, he said, when it comes to Islam, understanding has given way to apologetics, pure and simple. And so he was concerned about this phenomenon taking place from the left, about the Bowdlerization of Islam, the ahistorical discussion of Islam, the discussion of Islam as a liberating theology, a third world liberating theology. And he was clearly aware of the consequences that might have in the academy. Now, I don't know if he foresaw, this campus explosion 50 years later, but that to me was a striking insight. So it's been a long process. And then it's just, again, the left itself has had a long history. I don't know what, well, maybe because so many Jews are so, often left, flirt with the left. it's had this history, literally going back to the communists and through the decades of having a virulently anti-Semitic strain to it. It's just been that way, you know. Any other questions? Sure.
We all know that there's seemed to have happened years ago. But to give an example, my mind that will give a visual job is organizations such as Voice for Kids or
At least those are they're I'm sorry, but they're commies. I mean, that's what they are. Right.
You know, the marketing strategy was brilliant, and every movie kind of perpetuated this, what you said was an explosion. So it was very well thought out, very well planned propaganda marketing that hit on the very population that has been radicalized. So I guess a very simple explanation of that.
Is anyone curious? I mean, you can, I don't want to waste your time if you're not. I mean, you can see it I have it at my Rumble channel, but I actually have some recordings of these mosque sermons if anyone is curious. If mosque sermons from the Islamic Center of Rhode Island, it's not important but yeah, I have them right here, but you can also see them. I have them compiled at my Rumble channel. But if you've had enough, it's fine too. Yes. Right, right. Yeah, there's a very, I would just say that there's a very warped Islamophilia that they exhibit. So there have been rumors circulating for years that he may have converted, and I really don't know. But Prince Charles, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he studied the apologetics. Anyway, thank you very much. Sure, sure. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Hey, how do I get out of this?
Thanks, Andrew. I
Oh,
appreciate it.
thanks for showing up.
Some notes as I'm gonna come. Great work.
Thank you.